This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Thank you to all the supporters of the podcast. If you too would like an ad-free experience of the podcast, you can become a supporter at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. If you're in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, and the dark night of the soul, you do not have to do it alone. Join our private Facebook community, Deconversion Anonymous, and become a part of the community. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. There is a merch shop at TeePublic that Arlene has set up. You can get your Graceful Atheist and Secular Grace themed products. Links will be in the show notes. We are off next week. We will be back on August 20th. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. My guest today is Dr. Darrel Ray. Dr. Ray is the founder of both the Recovering from Religion and the Secular Therapy Project. He has been a psychologist. The brunt of his career was in organizational psychology. He started Recovering from Religion by using meetup.com by asking the simple question, how has religion hurt you? People poured out their souls and made a connection. Since then, he's written 2 bestsellers, The God Virus and Sex and God. As you're about to hear, Dr. Ray is a fascinating person and has done an amazing amount to impact the deconstruction, deconversion community. Here is Dr. Darrel Ray to tell his story. Dr. Darrel Ray, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks. Good to be here, David. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, glad that we could finally make this work. I have been a fan of Recovering from Religion, and we recommend the Secular Therapy Project about every other week. So glad to have it from the horse's mouth. So let's start just briefly with a bit of your bona fides, maybe a bit about your resume. You've written, obviously, a number of books, and you've been a psychologist for many years. Could you just tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I've been a psychologist, I guess, for 40 years. Kind of it dates me there, doesn't it? Or I don't know. It depends on how you start counting, but somewhere around that amount. Started out in counseling and then clinical psychology, and then moved into organizational psychology. So I've kind of had two and a half careers in the area of psychology, and then I got into what I'm doing now, and that is And I'm supposedly retired, but I look at all the work I do and think, damn, and nobody's paying me now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've written a couple books, The God Virus, which continues to sell really well, and Sex and God on how religion distorts sexuality. And those all come out of my clinical work that I've practiced off and on sex therapy and coaching and basic clinical psychology testing and all that. And I just saw patterns of behavior that seemed to be related to religion throughout my career. And retirement or coming close to retirement gave me the opportunity to start thinking about new things because I wasn't running my own business, my own practice. Anyway, I got started in the secular community in the mid 2006, 2007, I guess you could say, when I was ramping down my practice. And that during that time, I saw Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, Dennett, all those folks writing books, and I had read quite a bit before that. And it just dawned on me, nobody's written anything on the psychology of religion. I mean, right. Dawkins is a biologist. Harris is kind of a neuroscientist, but he's not a psychologist. So that gave me the notion that I loved all those books. I mean, The God Delusion was groundbreaking as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But I thought there needed to be something more accessible to the layperson on how the brain works, how religion influences us and gets us to do things we wouldn't normally do. I mean, for example, being a celibate priest or a celibate nun in the Catholic Church, that's pretty That's pretty strange behavior if you think about it.
Yeah.
So that all those things kind of came together, and I just figured it's time to do a brain dump, and I did. Starting in 2009, I just started writing and working, and then that led to what else we'll talk about a little bit later, and that's recovering from religion and all.
Before we get into your personal story, I just want to acknowledge that we had Rachel Hunt on the podcast several months ago.
She is an amazing. She's on the board of directors. She's our director of support group. She's amazing.
Yeah, just really appreciated her. And then I think that's how you and I got in touch with each other. So thank you to Rachel for doing what she does as well.
Yep.
So. Darrel, I know you probably tell this story often, but I'd very much like to hear, we like to ask our guests, what religious tradition or not did you grow up with? And then kind of what is the story of the trajectory of your loss of faith?
Well, I was born into a Christian family, pretty conservative, not fundamentalist, at least at the time. It got worse later. But going back before I was born, my relatives, my grandfather, my uncle, lots of religious people, lots of elders in the family. My great grandfather on my dad's side, my grandfather on my dad's side was country church preacher for 45 years. Other grandfather was an elder in the church and Sunday school teacher. My parents actually founded, they were church planters at one point in time and founded two different churches. When I was young, I was in my early teens when they were founding those churches. So as you can tell, I was surrounded by religion, but I was raised in an independent Christian tradition, which is kind of it's Campbellite. If anybody knows the history of religion in America, it was a mutation of Christianity that happened in the 1830s or so. It was one of those, we got to go back to the basics. We got to go back to the Bible, all that bullshit. So
yeah.
I was raised in the Campbellite. They weren't real strong. The Campbellite theology wasn't very good, I didn't think. And it was
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I went through adolescence early on, like when I was like 12 years old. I was visiting my aunt and uncle in New Mexico with my family. And they were teachers and the principal of Bureau of Indian Affairs school in Gallup, close to Gallup, New Mexico. So I loved going down there because it was wide open. You're right in the middle of the Navajo Indian Reservation, and I'm 12 years old. That's just a kid's dream. And behind them is this mesa that's 500 feet above the valley floor. And I love mountain climbing to this day. I mean, I've climbed 50 of the highest mountains in the continental U.S. So I'm going to go out and climb another one here, probably this summer. But I climb. If it's there, I want to climb it.
Yeah.
And that's
awesome.
12 years old. You couldn't slow me down. So I got to the top, and I'm looking around, and I find shark's teeth on the top of the damn mesa. I think, wow, that's really crazy.
Yeah.
I come down, I show it to my Aunt Margie and my mother, and I say, hey, look, shark's teeth on the top of the mesa. How'd they get up there? And my aunt says, well, God put them there in the flood. And I thought to myself, unkind words in my head. I know better than that.
Maybe not. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. So from the time I was 12 years old, I thought evolution was cool. I never bought the creation story. My grandfathers weren't too happy that they had a grandkid that didn't believe that God created the earth in 6 days and in 6,000 years ago. So, yeah, but they didn't disown me or anything, and I grew up to be who I wanted to be. But I always wanted to help. I was very socially active as I went through adolescence, very active in high school in various groups, and I sang in the choir. I was in the Model United Nations. I just had lots of. I was very curious, and you couldn't give me enough to read. I read constantly, which is kind of unusual for a adolescent boy. Although I was chasing girls too. I'm not saying okay. I was distracted sometimes. went to college at Friends University, FU for short. And
Yeah.
so, some people say it's Friends University of Central Kansas. I'll let you figure that out.
Yes. Nice.
Anyway, it was a good school then. It's since become an evangelical nightmare as far as I'm concerned. It was a good school. I got some good education. I majored in sociology and anthropology. I would have actually kind of minored in anthropology. I had enough to be a major, but they didn't offer a major. So I basically got a double major, but I couldn't claim it because they didn't offer it. But anthropology was a real big love of mine. I thought it just captured my attention. I liked sociology, but that wasn't my first love, even though that's what my major was. But the end of my college degree, I had a college deferment for the draft, so it was right in the middle of the Vietnam War. And if you didn't get a deferment, you were going to be cannon fodder in Vietnam. And I had been, from my freshman year, I did something. I look back and say, man, my 18-year-old self was braver than I am now. I'll tell you, I basically stood up and said, I ain't going to fight in that war, Mom. I'm not going to go there, Dad. If they can put me in jail if they want to, they can I'll go to Canada. But I am not fighting. I am not fighting in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And I'm going to file as a conscientious objector. So I did. I was discouraged, of course. Everybody thought I was horrible. You're not patriotic. You're not a true American for wanting to go kill people in another country that didn't do anything to us. And they said I won't get it, that I'll probably end up in jail. I mean, they did everything, to stop me. But I was successful. I got a what they call a conscientious objector status or whatever. And I was out there protesting the Vietnam War. I was protesting Richard Nixon. I was protesting Lyndon Johnson. I was protesting Spiro Agnew. I mean, all the people. I was out there protesting and even working a little bit at that time in civil rights. But main thing I got was a little part-time job. I don't know where the money came from, but it was pitiful money. I got a part-time job to get in my car and drive around to all the little Kansas colleges and hand out anti-war information and material and organize, try to get people to come to I wasn't organizing it, but come to our organized meetings and protests and all. So I was pretty politically active. And then when I got out of college, the war was starting to wind down, but the draft was still there. And I had this incredible desire. I've always had a desire to help people. It's just part of my nature. I've since learned to just accept it. I'm going to help you. I'm not going to help you against their will, but the only avenue I could see that to help somebody or be a helping professional was to go in the ministry. I really didn't understand. I took one psychology class in college. They didn't even have a psychology department in Friends University. That's how small the university was. So it wasn't like I thought, psychology would be a good way. I didn't even think of that. I went to seminary, and I looked around for a seminary that was social, that had a social justice component to it.
Okay.
Because I didn't want to preach in the traditional sense. I wanted to get out and get my hands dirty and work with people and engage in civil rights work or political work within the church. And so I got I went to Scarrett College for Christian Workers. It's not in existence anymore. The campus it's right across the street from Vanderbilt University in Nashville. But I went to Scarrett. I got a 2 years degree in religion with the goal of getting out and going and working in some kind of social justice or civil rights thing within the confines of the church. Which after 2 years, I realized the whole religion thing's kind of bullshit. I didn't believe much of it. I was still a liberal Christian, very liberal Christian.
Yeah.
But I started realizing this isn't what I want to do. So what am I going to do? So I went across the street to Vanderbilt University where they had the counseling center, and I took some tests, occupational tests and career tests. And they said I should be, the test showed I should either be a lawyer or a psychologist. So I said, I'm too honest to be a lawyer, so I must be having to be a psychologist. Okay. At least in my mind, I'm too honest. So.
Yeah.
So I went the psychology route. I accidentally, I didn't even intend to, but I got a job for a friend of mine at an institution for juvenile rehabilitation for juvenile delinquents. And I went there and I realized, woo, I really like this, and I'm pretty good at it too. At least that level, I was pretty good at it, I guess. So after about 6 months of that, I decided, well, I'm going to apply back at Vanderbilt at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University, and for a doctoral program, and I did, and I got in, and wow, I had a lot of fun. I was working full time. My wife and I were about ready to have a baby, and I was going to school full time in a doctoral program.
Yeah,
I look back now and say I couldn't do one of those three, let alone all three of them.
Yeah, exactly.
But it just felt right. You know, I the classes I was taking, the professors I was encountering, the research that I was able to get involved with, it was just really cool. And that gave me a nice boost into a career, a lifelong career of psychology. But what I learned, one of the things I learned in my doctoral level studies is I get bored with one thing. I've always got to be, you know, I like lots of variety. And counseling psychology wasn't really that interesting to me. So I didn't stay in that very long. I moved on into clinical psych, where I was doing a lot of testing and other things, getting some good training, and also getting the opportunity to train other people. And I learned at that time that I'm a good trainer. I can teach people.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed teaching people. But I was a terrible psychologist. On Monday, I was the best psychologist on the planet. On Tuesday, I was a damn good one, but by Wednesday, I was average, and you didn't want to get me on Thursday and Friday. So after a while, I realized this is not for me. You know, it takes a special person to see patients 5 days a week. I never had the energy, not that kind of energy. And my mind was always going somewhere else. Well, if you're in an office with me, you don't want my mind somewhere else. You're paying me to listen to you.
Yeah.
So that led me into organizational psych, because I'm good at organizing. I'm good at helping structure organizations so they function well. I understand the human factor, and that's ultimately I ended up in org psych after about 10 years in clinical, and I loved org psych. It was so fun, and I was interacting with VPs of Fortune 500 companies. I was flying all over the world. I had a really good career.
Yeah.
Very rewarding. But in the back of my mind the whole time, I'm looking at, I'm reading stuff. I'm looking at religion. I'm watched what the Freedom from Religion Foundation's doing, and I'm looking at the abortion issue. I'm looking at the religious right, what they're doing with Jerry Falwell in their early 80s. And it's not setting well with me. And I think, I'd really like to, and someday I want to do something like that or about that. So that's kind of, I guess you could say, the big picture into where I ended up and why I ended up here.
You mentioned that you were a liberal Christian for some time. Was there a moment when you decided that you weren't that either, that you were done entirely?
Well, yeah, I graduated in 1974 from seminary, and I was married. My wife and I were living in Nashville, and we kind of had an agreement. She was raised in a fundamentalist. Her parents were even more fundamentalist, and they were in the same denomination, but even more fundamentalist. And she and I had an agreement that we would just find the most liberal church. She wanted to always be in church. She always wanted to be going to church somewhere. So, okay, I can deal with that. Although I'd rather sleep in on Sunday. But I did that. I was compromising. But I also like teaching, So this comes back to make sense. I would go to church, and no matter what church we went to, I would end up teaching Sunday school.
Yeah.
I wasn't even a member of the damn church, and they'd let me teach Sunday school.
Yes.
Which is kind of dangerous, you know?
Yeah.
But, when they're desperate to find somebody to teach, and I taught, well, when I was in college, I was teaching the senior high kids Sunday school. Can you imagine me teaching senior high kids about evolution? I was teaching evolution when I was a sophomore and junior in college. I was teaching evolution in Sunday school at my home church.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And I got away with it.
Okay.
I was telling them, God could have created the world in 6 million years or 6,000 years. You taking that angle, and getting away with it. So I experimented with that, and I really enjoyed it. And then when I got married and we moved to Nashville, I had the opportunity to teach Sunday school again there. And then when I moved back to Kansas, where I live now, and my wife and I moved back here, we found the most liberal church we could find in Leavenworth, Kansas, which is hard to do because it's a military kind of.
Okay.
The Command and General Staff colleges here with the U.S. Army. So it's a pretty conservative area. We went to the Presbyterian church, but they were desperate for somebody to teach the adult Sunday school class. So I volunteered to teach. I'm not a Presbyterian.
Yeah, right.
In fact, I call myself a Quaker atheist. That's what I call myself today.
Yeah.
So I started teaching the adult class. They might get 4 or 5 people to show up for Sunday school on any given Sunday. It was a dead class, basically. So I take over, and within a month, I'm getting 30 and 40 people come to my class. Well, the room was too small, so they had to move me into a room that would hold 100 people. I never drew 100, but I was drawing 50 to 60 because I was bringing interesting things in, like mostly things like comparative religion. So let's compare Christianity, Hinduism. Let's find out about Sikhism. Let's find out what the Baha'i religion is. And they were just eating this shit up. These are inquisitive adults that had never learned a thing when they went to church. That's why they weren't coming. But when I started teaching, I was having a blast, because then I'd leave the Sunday school class and I'd go sing as a tenor soloist in the choir just 100 feet away, And I was a good singer. I was even going to major in voice in college, but I was terrible at music theory, so I had to give up that career. But I sang for years. So the answer to the question was, I was married. My wife wanted to go to church. I'm surrounded by religious family. We're going to a liberal church that the only reason I was enjoying it is because I'm teaching. And then marital problems happen. And after almost 18 years of marriage, we get divorced. Well, to me, that was like a declaration of independence. I no longer have to compromise. I don't have to get up on Sunday morning. I can go and do things that my ex-in-laws would be terrified at, go look, campaign for Jimmy Carter, or something like that.
Yeah.
Which no, it wouldn't have been Jimmy Carter at that time. It was Michael Dukakis.
Oh,
anyway,
right. Okay.
Yeah, I got to remember my presidents here. So that was the issue. It was that break from family, break from her family specifically, because my family always knew I was the weirdo. I'm the black sheep in the family. I'm the oldest child. And, I know a lot of privilege comes with being the oldest kid. There's other things, like sure. I had to do babysitting that I didn't like doing. But beyond that, the first kid kind of gets a privileged position. And I was able to leverage that to my advantage.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed my childhood. But back to why I got out. I really started reading more deeply once I got away from the marriage. And don't get me wrong, it was an amicable marriage. We actually used a mediator. We didn't go through divorce lawyers or anything, and we're still friends today. We've got 2 great kids, and there's no animosity or anything there. It's just separating from her family was a really good step for me, and it gave me an opportunity to read and interact and not go to church. And boy, I'll tell you, it was like decompression. It was fresh air. I could interact with people I wouldn't have normally interacted with. I could travel. My wife didn't like traveling, and I love traveling. And I have literally been all over most of the world since then.
Okay. Yeah.
I'd never been out of the United States before I got divorced. So now I'm traveling. Took my first trip to Europe in 1989, and
Okay.
been out of the country almost every year, at least once, except during COVID, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know that there was a single break, but I was an agnostic. I would call myself for a long time until I started dating my travel companion in 2001, and we're on a plane to Ireland, and we're going to go visit Ireland. And she says, "I'm sorry, we're on a plane to England," and she's reading my manuscript, the God Virus.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm everything but I'm an atheist,
Yeah.
everything but name. But remember, I'm still a psychologist. I still have a practice.
Right.
It's 2001 or 2000 and no, I'm sorry. She's reading an article, not this book. This book came later. And she reads up. She's on the plane. She looks up at him and says, "Darrel, you're an atheist. You need shit. You need to shit or get off the pot." And she'd been an atheist her whole life, So I said, "You're absolutely right, Judy. So I'm going to stop pretending. I'm definitely an atheist." This was 2000, 2001, somewhere around that time frame. And the fact was that I still couldn't say out loud I'm an atheist because I'm in a work environment. I'm a consultant.
Sure.
I'm interacting with religious people, and I just couldn't take the risk. I'm an independent businessman. My whole business depends on, and nobody asked me my religion. It wasn't a part of what I did until the God Virus came out in 2009. When I was writing that, I told my staff I'm writing this book. I had 5 staff members, and my office manager turned white and said, "Darrel, we're going to lose clients over this."
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, I need to do it. It's just in my blood. I can't avoid it." And she was right. I lost all but 2 clients within 6 months.
Wow.
Clients that I'd worked with for 20 years. Clients that had known me, trusted me, took my advice, worked with me closely, paid me lots of money. But just, it wasn't that I was an atheist. It was that I came out as an atheist.
Exactly.
I wrote a damn book about me.
Yeah.
So it was crazy. I learned a big lesson then that the society will tolerate you as an atheist. Just keep your mouth shut. Don't tell anybody. And that's kind of the way I've heard from many people, that talking about being it is one thing, talking about it's another thing.
I think there's a bunch of things there that people will relate to, and that's one of them. Is like the fear of social ostracization in one form or another, and particularly if your business is dependent upon it. So I want to hear about the beginnings of recovering from religion. I understand that you basically did a meetup.com, hey, come hang out, and that kind of exploded into what we now have as recovering from religion.
Yeah, I announced this. I was just after the God Virus came out, I was getting constantly inundated with people saying, "I love your book, but I need help." I couldn't possibly help all these people, and I wanted to. Obviously, that's why I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't. So I just decided, let me try something. I will confess, though, that it was a bit selfish in the beginning of this. I had a publicist. He was pretty much worthless. It cost a lot of money, didn't do anything, except one thing. In the process of trying to publicize the God Virus, he says, "Why don't you start an organization called Recover from Religion and use that to sell your book?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. So I decided to do that. I announced it on meetup.com, was fairly new at that time. I announced it on meetup.com, had the meeting at a little back room of an IHOP restaurant here in town, and 11 people showed up, and I only knew one of those 11 people. And after 2 or 3 hours, the restaurant owner is kicking us out. He's closing the room.
Yeah.
But during that time, I had people weeping and crying and telling their stories and hugging each other. I'm a good group facilitator. I know how to do group therapy. I mean, I got that training way back in graduate school. And this was like group therapy, but I wasn't being a psychologist. I was just facilitating a meeting. And I only asked 2 questions. I said, how did religion hurt you? And how have you benefited from leaving? It's all I said. And the rest of it was just making sure everybody got to tell their story. And I'll tell you, David, it was an explosion of emotion in that room. And it hit me hard as I was walking out. This is no gimmick. This is important. It's something people need, and I had no idea the need was so great. And that was the first meeting of Recovering from Religion. We then had another meeting a couple weeks later. Same thing happened. And we're getting ex-Moonies, ex-Scientologists, ex-Mormons, ex-Baptists. We're getting all sorts of people showing up. Ex-Catholics. I believe it was the second meeting. We had these 2 older gentlemen show up. They're both in their 70s. Late, one of them I know was almost 80 years old, and both of them are musicians. They play the organ in church.
Mm-hmm.
One plays for the Catholic Church. The other plays for some Protestant church, and they're both gay.
Yeah.
And they're sitting in the meeting, and I'm just assuming, because they sat next to each other too. I'm just assuming they know each other.
Yeah.
Turns out they didn't know each other. They had no clue, and they show up and they just accidentally sat next to each other, probably because they're both older white guys. And it turns out they're both gay. They're both musicians in church, and their church would throw them out in a heartbeat if they found out that they were gay. And they're now atheists.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all your fault, Darrel.
Yeah, that was a crazy meeting, really crazy. But so that was the beginning, and it took 3 or 4 years for us to get our nonprofit status and really get the organizational structure the way it needed to be. Now, like I said, I know how to organize. I know how to create businesses. So I just took my skills in that area and applied them to this organization, and I got bylaws and incorporation and all that sort of stuff. And it started growing, and ideas were starting to come in. And before you know it, the idea comes in: we should have a phone line, not just have meetings through Meetup, but have a phone line. So we gathered some money together, got some GoFundMe to do that, and we got a phone line started. And then not long after that, somebody said, why don't we start taking chats, because not everybody can call in. Plus, we were getting inquiries from overseas, from outside the continental United States.
Yeah.
So we started doing the chat thing, and these things just organically started growing. I cannot possibly do all this stuff, and I don't have the technical expertise, but I know how to facilitate it. And as we got volunteers with various skills, they would say, yeah, I can do that, or I know somebody can do that. And then the next thing was to really develop our training program and start trying to understand what's possible for us to do and what's out of our reach at that point in time. And in 2012, the issue of the first printing of Sex and God came out, and that caused another tidal wave of need. People are calling me and, I need help. I appreciate your book. I'm gay. I'm a quote sex addict, which there's no such thing, by the way. I just don't want to be unclear about that. And I'm trying to help all these people. And they say, I need a therapist. Every therapist I go to calls me a sex addict, or every therapist I go to says that I need to go back to church, or I need to pray about it, or, I'm violating God's law or some bullshit. I'm thinking, therapists shouldn't be doing that. That's unethical as hell. Until I started trying to find a therapist for people. And I couldn't. I mean, I'm a damn psychologist. I should be able to know the signs. But you can get on a therapist website and look at everything they've got and still not know if they're going to send you back to Jesus, or they'll have a cross around their neck, or they have a Bible on their table. So that led me to start the Secular Therapy Project. And in 2012, we started with 24 therapists I personally vetted. I knew they were secular. I knew they were evidence-based. I knew they were licensed. And in 12 years since we started, 11 years since we started, I'm sorry, we've now got 734 registered therapists. And every therapist has been vetted to make sure they meet those 3 criteria. And we turn down about 30 to 40% of all applicants because they don't qualify. I mean, we take this shit seriously. The worst thing that could happen is one of our therapists would practice woo-woo on you or say, you need more spiritual guidance or, some bullshit that comes out of their own religious worldview. So we pretty much vet all of our therapists to make sure there's none of that going to happen. And we're very strict about it. So anyway, so that's the story of both Recovering from Religion and Secular Therapy Project.
Yeah, very cool. And again, we, at the podcast, we recommend all the time. We're very pro therapy to begin with, and then we reference people to Secular Therapy Project as many, many people tell their stories and they'll say just what you've described. They went to a therapist, maybe even their website was unclear, but then they get, you have to read your Bible more. And that just isn't an answer to the real world problems they're experiencing.
Well, and then after that happened, I started getting more information about how various institutions, universities, if you will, are training therapists. And I realized that there's been an explosion of universities that are training marriage and family counselors. Mm-hmm. And most of those institutions are religious institutions. And they're giving people master's degrees in marriage and family counseling from Regents University or George Fox University or Liberty University. Those are all fucking fundamentalists as hell. So what are you really learning in those institutions? What you're really learning is a few techniques that might be psychologically sound, but mostly how do you bring people back to Jesus? Yeah. Or how do you, because families, that's the way you infect people with religion. You do it through children. So that's why the emphasis in so many institutions, religious institutions of higher learning, has been on marriage and family counseling. It's a lot easier to set that up. And, a lot of people are wanting to come. They want to help children, want to help families. And they also believe in Jesus. So I have been so shocked sometimes at, for example, you can get a PhD at Regents University, which is Pat Robertson's university. Okay. And you will go, one of the requirements is you have to go through a year of Pat Robertson theology that says God sends hurricanes to Orlando because of the case.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Okay. So you got a PhD from the university that teaches that shit. And why? I mean, that's just so unethical. And yet they got a PhD. They are licensed in the state of their residence, maybe. So we're challenging that. We're starting to try and challenge that. And our current director, Dr. Travis Vorst, McKee Vorst, is actually making speeches around he's done it once. He had to cancel this weekend, but he's making talks about religious privilege in therapy. And that's crazy. Why would religion be privileged in therapy? And you can go look this up. I did a talk at the last year at the conference on religious trauma on why does professional psychology ignore religion, religious trauma, religious abuse. And there's a lot of implied training within many universities that you don't touch people's religion, even though that religion may have caused the abuse or the trauma that you're trying to treat. How the hell do you do that? How do you treat religious trauma without talking about religion? Anyway, so that's where I'm at right now in my career. I'm really pushing religious trauma.
That's a great segue. That's what I kind of want to talk about next. Just a bit about the psychology of religion and or the deconversion process. But as a jumping off point, you describing the God virus is it's almost like a transmission vector. Religion is going through families, as you just mentioned, generally indoctrination at childhood. My experience, I became a Christian in my late teens. I already had a very, much a sense of identity already. And what I've been shocked at as I've interviewed people is how devastating it is for those people who grew up with it, right? Like,
yeah, right.
5 years old, you're a rotten sinner. You're going to hell if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And that stays with a person.
Right.
So maybe
just
if you could talk about a little bit about your understanding from that perspective.
Yes, and I think this is there's a lot of new information that's just come out in, let's say, the last 5 or 10 years about things like trauma, and I'm not talking religious trauma, just trauma in general, and how to treat it, how trauma affects the brain, that sort of stuff. And there's other information. I think what we are doing, what I'm doing, and what my colleagues within Recovery from Religion and the Psychotherapy Project are doing is we're taking this research that's being applied to, people who were abused by their, in childhood, or somebody who's think of a refugee coming from Syria right now. A 10-year-old kid from Syria is probably experiencing trauma, or a soldier or a family member in Ukraine. They're experiencing trauma. So those are all traumas that we can put our finger on. We understand much more lately what that means and how to treat it and why it's so hard to treat in some cases. But nobody said, okay, let's look at this. How many people have been traumatized by war? How many people have been traumatized by non-religious child abuse? I mean, there's been a lot for sure. But I'm guessing there's more people throughout history have been abused by religion than any other single thing. I mean, religion has built-in abuse. So look at the Catholic Church pedophile problem, or the Jehovah's Witness sexual abuse problem. There's just so much of it out there that's been covered up, never been examined until relatively recently. And that's where we're at. We're saying, let's look at all this. And then we see in Recovery from Religion, we see this just difficult emotional journey that people have, and their tendency to be drawn back into religion, or they leave religion and they still can't get over the fear of hell, or they leave religion and they lose their whole family, so they lose the connection there. So there's a lot going on there. It's not a simple psychological formula. It's a massive amount of emotional complexity, and it's if you think about it, when you separate from religion, you're losing. You're losing a lot of things. You might lose parents. You might lose your own kids. You might lose your marriage.
Yeah.
You might lose your job. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities there. Every one of those losses evokes grief. So you've got a complex pattern of grief to have to deal with. It's hard enough to get over one thing that you're grieving over, let alone something as massive and big as this incredibly big worldview change you're going through. And then there's another piece that I think is interesting that we've been talking about lately, and that's attachment theory. As we know, we have attachment systems in our brain, and they're very important for our survival as a species, because our infants are so immature. It takes years for a human infant to become self-sufficient. And I'm not talking now, I'm talking about 10,000 years ago when we were still hunter-gatherers. You can't let a 5-year-old just go. They'll get eaten by a lion.
Yeah. Yes.
So you have to be careful how you raise children, and those children better be bonded to you, better have a close attachment, because the best guarantee of survival is attachment to the parent that can protect you and teach you how to survive in this dangerous world. whether the dangerous world is savannas of Africa or the jungles of New York City. I mean, it doesn't matter. There's danger out there. And that attachment is important. So we have very strong attachments as humans to other humans. And we know this from a very old and unethical experiments. For example, the Harry Harlow experiments on monkeys back in the 60s, which today are totally unethical, but they were done, and we know that attachment is so important to the baby monkey that baby monkeys will fail to thrive. They will literally die from lack of attention. And then there's other experiments like the Romanian orphanage crisis that happened after or late in the Ceausescu's dictatorship back in the 70s. We have the same thing happening to human infants. They're getting plenty of food. They're getting nutrients. They're not getting attention. They're not getting human contact, and they're dying or growing up with incredibly bad, difficult mental health issues. Well, what we're seeing in religious deconversion is they're having to deal with that detachment.
Yeah.
Now, the attachment is strong, and most of us stay attached to our family or our parents the rest of our lives. Most of us, not all of us by a long shot, but then what if I have to tear that attachment off? My brain is going to go through some cycles, a lot of cycles, about how do I reconnect with my parents? How do I tell my parents I'm an atheist? How do I do this or that? And all these things have consequences for the attachment. And what we understand better now is that this incredibly difficult time people have leaving religion is tied up with the grief and loss of all these things, but also is tied up in attachment. And how do I mean, it's a big step to step totally away from your parents, because that's where the original attachment was.
Yeah.
Or to be rejected by your parents. And so it takes a huge amount of effort, psychological energy, emotional energy to make that step. And it requires help. Most people have a hard time doing it by themselves.
Yeah.
Especially if they're raised in an environment where they were gaslighted, say, or really abused as children. Because as we know, an abused child still has a very strong attachment. It may be an unhealthy attachment, but the attachment's still there. So a lot of what we do at Recovering from Religion and Secular Therapy Project is simply helping people deal with their, I call it detachment.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I love that framing, actually. And I know that the listeners are going to respond to that or see themselves in that.
Yep. So let's just call it detachment syndrome.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's a part of religious trauma syndrome, of course, but it's detachment.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say that, because I've heard you say in the past that you agree that religious trauma exists, but you at one point in time said you didn't think that religious trauma syndrome was a thing.
My mistake. I don't usually add the word syndrome. I still don't. And it's
Could you explain that? Yeah.
It's more a technicality. I don't think the layperson really cares.
Okay.
But if you have a disease, there's a pattern of symptoms. I'm talking of physical disease.
Right.
There's a pattern of symptoms that tell you what that disease is. If you got measles, there's probably 4 or 5 things that are observable and testable that will tell you it's measles. The same thing is true of psychological conditions as well, mental conditions. So you need to be able to determine what those symptoms are with some degree of accuracy and independent, objective observation in order to say, okay, we have a cluster of symptoms here, and the cluster adds up to religious trauma syndrome. A syndrome is a cluster of symptoms. That's all it is.
Okay.
So I don't think we're scientifically at the place where we can say we have a syndrome. We don't have a cluster of symptoms. Now, I do think, and Dr. Marlene Waddell and I kind of disagree a little bit on this, although I'm a great admirer of her work and the fact that she coined the term religious trauma. I think someday we may be there. But, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if we ever call it syndrome or not.
Okay.
Because we have a set of criteria within the DSM that helps us understand and identify trauma, just trauma, without respect to religion.
Right.
And if you have those symptoms, you have trauma. You have a trauma syndrome. You have a cluster of symptoms that fit the diagnosis of trauma. Now, where that trauma comes from, it could come from childhood abuse, it could come from a bomb going off in a war, it could be being a refugee that has had periods of starvation. All those things could cause trauma, or it could come from the terror that happens, having people shooting guns around you in a war, or it could be the terror of being told you're going to hell every day, and that Satan is speaking to you when you touch your genitals and masturbate or whatever,
Yeah.
So I don't care which one of those you choose, they all lead to trauma. So we don't need religious trauma syndrome. We just need to understand what trauma is. And then we might, if we really want to help the person, we're going to have to understand where that trauma came from. And if it came from religion, then we need to label that as religious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's you don't need to go any farther than that to treat somebody.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I appreciate the clarity there. So. I've been kind of waiting to get here. So your second book is Sex and God, and you also did the Sex and Sexuality podcast. A massive theme of the people that get interviewed is the effect of purity culture on their sexuality as adults, even as deconverts. Maybe talk a little bit about what effect that has on a person and the repression of normal human sexuality.
Yeah. Well, we could almost go right back to the attachment piece, because if you think about it, the first human being you're attached to is probably your mother. The second one may be your father or another close caregiver. When you become an adult, that attachment approach you take into adulthood, because what is marriage but some kind of attachment? But if you're going into adulthood with a messed up attachment system in your mind, in your brain, then you don't know how to attach to other people. Well, what religion does is religion comes along in your early teens and tells you your body is your enemy, normal sexual behavior is the devil talking to you, that you shouldn't have thoughts, that you shouldn't have sexual thoughts. So we've got the religious thought police involved.
Yeah.
And all these things are oppressing you and confusing your mind about how to view your own body and how to view other people's bodies, how to have a relationship with another human being with a body. And then what if you're gay? What if you are LGBTQ? What if you're trans? You're getting incredibly mixed messages here. They're just incredibly confusing. So is it any wonder that people have a hard time creating healthy attachments, sexual attachments, because they had such a terrible model in their teens? And if they were raised religious, their own parents also were infected with this purity idea. My own family is a perfect example of this. My grandmother got married to a man named Thompson in somewhere around 1929. She got pregnant. She had my father. 1928. My father was then born in 1929.
Okay.
She was a flapper. She was a wild girl. She was out there dancing every okay. night.
Yeah.
Now, of course, she would admit to it only marginally. You couldn't get her to say too much there. So she has my dad and by the time my dad was 10 months old, and the time frame is unclear because there was no documentation.
Yeah.
By the
Yeah.
time that my dad's 10 months old, the U.S. Census in 1930 shows my grandmother living with a guy named Ray.
Okay.
So
Okay.
she was married to Thompson. There's no divorce records.
Yeah.
And now, and oh, by the way, the U.S. Census in 1930 says my grandmother Pearl Ray is living with a guy named Thompson. So the records show she's living with Thompson and she's living with Ray.
All right.
It's okay if she wants to be polyamorous. I don't care. But that wasn't the way she looked at it. And she was so ashamed of that little fact that we didn't find out. We didn't find out about this till much, much later, after she was dead. She basically lied to us her whole life about the fact that she may have had a baby, quote, out of wedlock. We're not sure. We're not sure about the timeline here. And then there's a divorce paper. The divorce papers show up in 1941. Now, this is 11 years after she had moved out.
Yeah.
So she's been living with my grandfather in sin for 11 years.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that's purity culture at its best or worst. I don't know what you call it.
Yeah. Yes.
And then she gets religion around 1941 or 2. Big time religion. I don't know what caused it, but she goes or dives, takes a deep dive into Jesus.
Uh-huh.
My grandfather becomes Ray. My grandfather Ray. He's the only grandfather I knew, but he's not my genetic grandfather. He becomes a preacher and a Sunday school teacher and all this. I mean, they really get into religion. And my grandmother decides that my dad needs to get circumcised because that's the Christian thing to do. Circumcision was never practiced in the United States until about 1890. It started. It had never been practiced.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a fundamentalist Kellogg cereal.
Okay.
Dr. Kellogg started the notion that boys shouldn't masturbate, that masturbation leads to mental illness, and one way to reduce or eliminate masturbation is to circumcise boys. So in the 1890s, early 1900s, he started this campaign of forcing boys to get circumcised and shaming parents into it and saying, look, Jesus intended us all to be circumcised. And it was a religious notion. He may have never had sex his whole life. We're not sure. He was married, but he never had kids. And he was too busy shaming everybody else. And he belonged to a sect of Christianity that was pretty weird. I think the Seventh-day Adventist or some derivative of that. I forget. But anyway, remember, Dr. Kellogg of Kellogg cereal is the one that fucked a lot of men up.
Yeah.
A lot of us, including me.
I have some words for him as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so my grandmother forces my dad at 12-year-old to get circumcised without anesthesia.
Oh my. Wow.
That is purity culture.
Yeah.
At its extreme. If you think about it, Muslims do that now to boys and girls. All Muslim culture do it to boys. Several do it to girls with no anesthesia at 12 years old. You just read Ali's her book about Ayaan Hirsi Ali book. You'll hear the worst of it. But so my dad experienced this, and then I watch, as his son, my parents' son, I get access to information about them or know things, and my mom always wanted to confide shit to me. She probably shouldn't have, but I was like a psychologist of the family when I'm 15 years old.
You were a good listener, yeah.
And I find this all out, and my mom says this really messed up your dad. I mean, he has a hard time with sex. He loves sex, I know that, but they did not have a good sex life for years, but partly because of this. And in fact, it took my grandmother dying. Their sex life did not really get good until after my grandmother died. I think
Wow.
something like that had a cathartic effect on him, and he was able to move on. So I just look at my own family and look at what did purity culture do to my family, and I've only gotten up to my father's generation.
Yeah.
The rest, I mean, I got so many more examples in my generation and then two more generations. I'm old enough to have two generations now, and I'm watching the religious trauma still work its way out. I'll give you an example. A relative of mine had a baby, quote, baby out of wedlock. I hate that term, but that's what the term they used back then.
Sure.
So
yeah.
she was shamed for having this baby before she got married. She did get married, but when the baby was born, it had a birth defect, a serious birth defect.
Ooh, okay.
And she believed, this is purity culture at work, that God was punishing her and her baby for her having sex outside of marriage.
Oh, man.
Now, that would have been the next generation beyond me.
Yeah.
And that person has now grown up. And throughout this poor person's early life, they were abused because God was punishing them.
Oh, man.
There's a lot of child abuse going on here. So much so that other relatives had to take the child because the mother was not capable or was abusive. Now that child has grown up. That child has had other children, and the same thing is being perpetuated by them.
Wow.
So you go back to 1929 through to today, and you can see a pattern of religious sexual abuse and purity culture through how much is that? 80, 90?
Yeah. Wow.
That's a long time. It's 90 years, 90
Yeah.
years of trauma in one family. And I'm sure my family is not unusual at all.
Wow, I really appreciate giving us the personal perspective on that. That was really, really valuable. Last topic, you hinted at it when talking about Catholic priests and nuns who are celibate, but I've heard you talk about the connection to hard right, like the Proud Boys. For some reason, there's this purity element within what are not obviously religious ideologies. And maybe we could talk about how that happened and why, maybe?
Wow. Okay. That's okay. Wow. That's a whole other. We got 3 more hours. I will just say that to begin with, all ideologies have within them the elements of a religion. It doesn't matter. If you read my book, The God Virus, I talk about communism as a religion. I mean, You look at Russia, Lenin is in a tomb as if he's immortal,
Right.
The pharaohs were immortalized as gods. Well, same thing, they immortalized Lenin as a god. You look at North Korea, they've Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il, one of those Kims.
Yes.
is now he's president for eternity. I mean, that's their word.
Right.
He's been dead for 30, 40 years, and he's still president. There will never be another president as far as they're concerned. So those are religious ideas from what appears to be a secular ideology. And how many ideologies? I mean, Nazism was an ideology, but it had incredible amounts of religious overtones to it. And wasn't Hitler really godlike in the minds of those people?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at things like the ideology that Putin's trying to espouse in Russia to justify the imperialistic czarist kind of expansion, it looks like the religion of nationalism, just like the religious right is looking at ideology of Christian nationalism. These ideologies are remarkably similar because the brain works the same whether you're a Russian, you're an Egyptian pharaoh, or you're a Jerry Falwell. The human brain has these tendencies, and there's openings in the brain for what it needs to absorb to survive.
Right.
And religion's just come along and says, oh, we can take advantage of that. Religion, to use the metaphor, is a virus, just like I've said in the book. So ideologies are simply a virus, just like any other biological virus. The virus of Christianity wants to get from my brain to your brain. Now, the most effective way to do that is to go through children, is to brainwash, indoctrinate children. That's the most effective. But, you got the Jehovah's Witnesses that knock on your door. When they're knocking on your door, they're trying to sneeze on you.
Right.
And the same thing for Mormons. They're trying to sneeze on you. They're trying to give you their God virus.
Yeah.
Well, so no matter whether you call it the Proud Boys, or you call it the Nazi Hitler's youth, it doesn't matter. It's an ideology that's infected the brain that gives a sense of longing and comfort and attachment. And I don't think, I don't want to overemphasize it, but I also want to emphasize enough that we should start acknowledging that attachment is a component of what ideologies bring. They give me a sense of security. That's what you're seeking as a child. That's why you're attaching to your caregiver, is you want that security so you can survive. Well, ideologies come along and says, we have the answer to surviving in this environment. And once you get infected with it, your rational brain is much weaker than this. I mean, it's so weak.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of effort to rationally work yourself out of these. So there's a lot of purity culture in things like the incels or the Proud Boys. There's a lot of purity culture going on there because they've discovered the same thing that religion discovered. I don't quote Richard Nixon often, but this is one of the times I think he's correct here. If you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. If you've got them by their genitals, if you've got them by their sexuality, they will follow. And that's what all these ideologies are doing. If you look at Russian communism, it was incredibly sexually repressive. If you look at Chinese communism, from the very beginning, it has been incredibly sexually repressive. Even though Mao Zedong had many, many girlfriends, concubines, wives, whatever he had, of course, it never belongs to the leader of the cult. The cult is not restricted by these rules, but everybody else is. Communist China ideology is sexually negative. Russian communist ideology is sexually negative. Proud Boys is sexually negative. It's because sexuality is so important to us. If you can control a person's sexuality, you've got them. They cannot get away. And then if you create fear around that sexuality and terror of my own body, or terror that I might, for example, if whatever the ideology is says gays are the enemy and I'm gay, I'm going to have to look extra macho. I'm probably going to have to do things to show that I'm worthy of the cult leader. And so you get gay Republicans in Congress, they're out.
Right.
Or gay fundamentalist ministers doing crazy shit. But it's just a psychological pattern I've seen. It's time after time after time. Whether you call it religion or ideology, they use the same techniques.
I think that's actually a profound insight, that if you have their sexuality, that you basically have their minds and hearts as well. So.
Yeah. And Richard Nixon, of all people, said that.
Yeah.
If you look at, there's a documentary, I think it's called Wild Wild West. It's about a guru from India that comes to Portland, Oregon, I think it was. And I watched the documentary. It's like a classic study in all this shit.
Yeah.
He was incredibly sexually, his cult was sexually restrictive, yet he's screwing a whole bunch of women. And look at the Waco, Texas, the Branch Dravidians.
Yeah.
He had 20 or 30. Look at the Mormons. Joseph Smith, 38 wives. Brigham Young, 54 wives or 52 wives. Who knows? They lost count.
Yeah.
So the cult leader is not restricted by the rules, but they know the formula for getting people infected is through religion. Religion is a sexually transmitted disease.
Interesting.
Yeah. If you think about it, without sex, religion could not be transmitted. It would be very hard. You've got to have purity culture or some. I mean, that's Hinduism. Hinduism is an incredibly purity culture oriented religion. And so is Islam. I mean, they're incredibly sexually restrictive. So I rest my case there. Find me an example that contradicts, and I'll be very interested in that example. But I haven't seen one yet.
I think that is the mic drop. I also appreciate that you bring out that this is not limited to Christianity in any way. It's not even limited to religion, that
Right.
ideologies in general. I think that's a profound insight. Dr. Darrel Ray, thank you so much. I want to give you a moment just to talk about anything you want to promote, the Secular Therapy Project.
Well, if people need help, if they're dealing with some of the issues you and I have talked about, go to recoverfromreligion.org, hit the chat button, or call our number 8184, I doubt it. And you can call us from anywhere we've got 5 phone numbers directly from English-speaking countries like South Africa, like Australia, and so forth. But you can literally call us from anywhere on the planet if you've just got an internet connection, because we have web call as well. And we can help you. And we can help you in many ways. We can get you resources that you probably can't find yourself. You just tell us your story, tell us what you're struggling with. We will find resources. We have a very huge, vetted, very curated library that we can find stuff and help get help for you. We can also connect you with local groups if you want to face-to-face meet with people. We don't have groups in every city, but even if you don't have one in your city, we have virtual groups that meet by Zoom, just like you and I are doing right now. They're meeting all the time, and you can meet with other people who are going through the same thing you are. Or if you want to get in and talk to other people, maybe you're an ex-Mormon, you're an ex-Jehovah's Witness, maybe you're LGBTQ+, and you want to talk to other people and you're having same issues, you can talk to us and we can let you into our private Slack channel. You have to come through us. You cannot find it on the internet. Come to us, say, I'd like to join the ex-Mormon group or whatever. We can connect you with that as well. And then, of course, if you need professional, we're just peer support. But if you need psychological professional support, you go to the Secular Therapy Project and register at the STP, and then you can just search close to your zip code. It's kind of like online dating. You can search for anybody close to you, and then you email them through our system, so you maintain confidentiality and privacy. And then once you've found a therapist that fits your needs, you make an appointment. And then it's you step outside of our system and go get the therapy you need.
Excellent.
Other than that, I'd say read my book, Sex and God, or read The God Virus. I think almost any human on the planet would probably benefit from either or both of those books, if I do say so myself.
Well, I concur. And we will have links in the show notes to all of those things. So, Dr. Darrel Ray, you've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, David.
Final thoughts on the episode. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. What's important to me is that the deconstruction process and the move away from religious thought has scientific underpinnings, and we get to hear that from someone like Dr. Darrel Ray. The quote of the episode has to be, "Religion is a sexually transmitted disease." I think what Dr. Ray meant there is that religion propagates from parents to children, and it's in that indoctrination that allows religion to continue. Also thought it was very insightful to make the connection to attachment theory, and that part of the grief process of deconstruction and deconversion is the loss of that attachment both to community and to a sense of God's presence. I think that's absolutely true, and why it can be so traumatic and painful when we come out of religion. At the podcast here, we are trying to be as open as possible to as many people as possible. But it's also good to reflect at times that religion can be criticized. The analogy that Dr. Ray uses of a virus is valid. And as Dr. Ray said, to quote, "I'm guessing there are more people throughout history that have been traumatized by religion than any other single thing. Religion has built-in abuse." It's okay to say that that is an abusive system. It is okay to want to leave and to get out. If you need to talk to somebody, the Recovering from Religion is a great place to start. They have, as Dr. Ray pointed out, both telephone numbers and online. You can reach out to somebody and have a conversation. They also have a bunch of resources, including more liberal churches. So if you aren't ready to leave, they have those kinds of resources as well. No one there is trying to deconvert anyone. They are there to listen to you. We'll also mention the Secular Therapy Project if you're looking for a therapist who is not going to ask you to read your Bible more and pray more. It's free to you to find the therapist. You do need to pay the therapist once you engage with them. But the Secular Therapy Project is a great database to find people who have gone through that rigorous vetting that Dr. Ray spoke of in the interview. We will obviously have links in the show notes. I want to thank Dr. Darrel Ray for being on the podcast, for sharing with us his wisdom, his education, his expertise, and his personal story. I think it was really valuable to hear the personal side of the scientific aspect that Dr. Darrel brings to the table. Thank you so much, Dr. Ray, for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is about independence. I recently had the experience that many of you have had as well of being the atheist at church. While there, I tried to think of it from an anthropological point of view. I was watching my former faith tradition with fresh eyes and how I might experience it had I been at a religious ceremony that was unfamiliar to me. And it was striking, like what would lead people to raise their hands and sing and be demonstrative about their faith. And it struck me that it was absolutely about culture. It's about being a part of the in-group and conforming to be accepted by that group. And I want to encourage you that if you were one of the people who couldn't conform, you couldn't make it work, and you needed to be independent, that's actually a good thing. Beyond religion, we are products of our culture. If you're listening to this in the United States, you're an American, you have a set of cultural ideas that are built in. And some of those are great, and some of them may not be. And so independence and the ability to be an independent thinker is critical, maybe especially in the moment in time in which we are in, politically and technologically, that we have to be able to question what we are given, question the expectations to conform. I don't mean here rejection of norms just for rejection's sake, but rather critically taking a look at what we accept to be true and good and moral, really working through that individually to the best of our abilities. We are going to take another week break, so we are back on August 20th. Arlene interviews our guest, MJ. That's going to be a great conversation. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.